I want to start with a small anecdote about a crisis faced by this country. In 2001, not right now. By the way, it's weird, I had to sit on the train actually. I've got some slides coming up later and I never thought I'd have to check the daily news today to see whether some of the information in my slides is actually still up to date, but never mind. Anyway, so take your minds back to February 2001, February the 19th, and the detection of the first case of foot and mouth disease in Essex. There were more cases a few days later, and then the disease exploded across Northumberland, Devon, North Wales, Cornwall, and the Lake District. It swamped the country in a matter of days. In total, some 6 million sheep and cows were killed before the disease was brought under control. If any of you remember that time, you might, and had gone on holiday perhaps to Northumberland, you might have seen the towering smoke as they were trying to destroy the carcasses. It devastated not only the livestock industry of the country via a complete ban on all animal movement as well as their sale, but it devastated the tourist industry for a year, in fact longer than a year, with most of our most beautiful regions of the country effectively off limits to all visitors. Cost in total, some £8 billion. Why am I talking about it? Well, the UK government struggled to cope with the outbreak, badly. That's not what's interesting. What is of interest, though, is why. The outbreak simply did not behave as it should. Spreading out from an initiation point, it emerged all over, and so the authorities struggled to get out in front of the wave front of the disease and to put quarantine in place in order to eradicate it. What the authorities eventually discovered was that the model that they had of the network of how cattle are raised, moved and sold at market was utterly wrong. Instead of local nodes clustered around an abattoir and a series of cattle markets, some enterprising folk had worked out that a moving network of cattle trucks with sat-navs, plus a network of price spotters with mobile phones at each market, could enable a rather lucrative arbitrage opportunity, as cattle were moved around the country, being bought at the cheapest prices and sold hours or even days later at much higher prices. The injection of an illegally imported animal into this system is all that it took. 13 months, 8 billion, and not one but two industries devastated. So this is talk about the need to better understand how things move around networks. And in our case, I think for most of the people in this room, it's about how information moves and is propagated and lives and dies, if indeed it ever does. And this is also a talk that will try to look back at our understanding of networks and information propagation and set that in the context of what we know today. So let's start here with this quote from a 2008 article in the New York Times that I think has turned out to be really rather telling. If the news is that important, it will find me. It was picked up and expanded further as an idea by a gentleman called Jeff Jarvis. Any of you familiar with Jeff Jarvis? One or two of you? Yeah, you read the books? Journalist, associate professor at the New York Graduate School of Journalism, and this was in his 2009 book, What Would Google Do? His essential hypothesis here was that given the above, newspapers should realize that they were in the link economy and that they must do 5 things. 1, produce unique content with clear value. Commodity content gets you no links or Google juice. You must open up so Google and the world can find your content. When you get inbound links and audience, you must exploit them via advertising. And, well, actually, that was it. You must use links to find new efficiencies. That one, by the way, was never explained further. And you must find opportunities to create value above this link layer via curation, technology infrastructure, and advertising networks in order to monetize the links and the traffic. It's worth noting that at this point when this quote came out, and indeed when he wrote his book, that Facebook didn't actually have a mobile app. And, well, all sorts of people were not yet on Twitter. So this thinking, as the title of the book suggests, is actually all about search results, not social networks. It's interesting to note that the social networks, though, are the ones that have achieved item number 5. In 2019, this is working out really well for the newspapers. Anyway, if I can get this, I thought I'd cheer you up with a nice man from another time.
Tonight, for the 7th long year, the American people heard a State of the Union that didn't reflect the America we see and didn't address the challenges we face. But what it did do was give an urgent reminder of why it's so important to turn the page on the failed politics and policies of the past and change the status quo in Washington so we can finally start making progress for ordinary Americans.
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. Yes, we can. It was the epoch of incredulity. Make America great again. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. And that quote goes on, and at no point does it ever stop being relevant. Obama was the first politician to exploit the network effect. That response that we just saw to George's final State of the Union was released on YouTube, itself only 16 months into ownership by Google, and largely ignored by the newspapers and the other major US networks. But it did hit its target in those who expected the news to find them. The Obama election team built a digital influencer targeting model that allowed him to be arguably the greatest powerhouse of modern times, the Clintons, and then go on to easily beat his Republican opponent, Senator John McCain. Even the racists voted for him, and in case you're wondering, I had people that I knew that were actually campaigning in the Midwest for Obama, and that is a direct anecdote that was told to me. But here's the point. Trump did it better. The Trump campaign, can you see, while I'm talking, do take a good look at the titles on the spines of those books. The Trump campaign and other campaigns have deployed the tools and techniques and approaches that leverage the social network to achieve their aims, to win their wars, to capture the hearts and minds of just enough people to achieve their goals, to become elected to the highest office in the land, or win a plebiscite on the nature of a nation's relationship with its neighbours. This is a screen grab from Jamie Bartlett's absolutely superb two-part documentary, Secrets of Silicon Valley. Have any of you seen that? Yeah, okay, one or two of you at the back. Okay, it's not currently on iPlayer. If it had been, I'd have given you a link. Do keep an eye out for it. Jamie Bartlett, Secrets of Silicon Valley. It is absolutely superb. I'd say it's probably one of the very best documentaries of this decade. This bookshelf is that of the now disgraced, but certainly not defeated, CEO Alexander Nix of Cambridge Analytica fame. I won't go into the murky details of the players who work with Cambridge Analytica. There's another documentary available on Netflix for that. But a considerable amount of money has been spent in order to enable a bunch of very, very smart people to figure out optimal ways to place carefully curated and targeted information into the infostreams of valuable target recipients. And the question here is whether it actually works. So let's take a look. Eli Pariser. Anybody remember Eli Pariser? Yeah? Filter bubbles? Ringing any bells? I've got bright lights shining at me, so I'm struggling to hear you. Okay, right. So he's the CEO of Upworthy, a company that surfaces meaningful viral content. Take a look at his site and see if you agree with that. But anyway, he came up with the idea of the filter bubble back in 2010. By 2011, there was a TED talk, of course, and then a book, both with a nice set of examples of how the application of individualized personalization algorithms from Google and YouTube were creating a, quote, personal ecosystem of information catered to by these algorithms. He wrote, "A world constructed from the familiar is a world in which there's nothing to learn, since there is invisible auto-propaganda indoctrinating us with our own ideas." Here's the opposing view. Because the idea of the filter bubble has attracted a variety of research and indeed no little criticism. Axel Bruns is professor at the Digital Media Research Centre at the Queensland University of Technology. He argues actually there's very little evidence to support the true existence of filter bubbles, and further argues that the term and the associated echo chamber are poorly defined and conceptually vague. Bruns defines the filter bubble as the personalised infosphere and the echo chamber as a more communal experience where one's views are tightly aligned with those of a population of like-minded souls. He makes the point that many arguments tend to mix and conflate the two, and likewise with the evidence to support those concepts. So he documents the research apparently debunking the hyper-personalization of search results, with evidence that diverse users are served very similar information in response to the same search terms. And then he turns his attention to social media networks. Now, at this point, he calls out again the shortcomings of the research in this area. So he proposes a tight definition, and when an academic decides to redefine something, always pay good attention to what they're actually doing. He proposes a tight definition of the two terms, the filter bubble being described as the network of communication between the connections that exist within a network, and the echo chamber being described as the connection structure of Facebook friends or Twitter follower networks. On the one hand, yay for a clear description, but on the other hand, I'm not so sure that you can decouple the medium from the messaging. The studies apparently show a mixed picture, but it's interesting to see that polarization is found, and he does acknowledge that. But one of the points he makes is that ideologues and partisans interact very frequently across the gulf, as it were. And he also picks up the fact that some things are more polarizing than others. Enter Stewart et al. And their research, Information Gerrymandering and Undemocratic Decisions. By the way, that's the abstract for the paper. They looked at situations where two groups of individuals struggle with a decision they need to be made. And they build a model of behaviour, voting behaviour in this case, using game theory. And the essential model is that whilst each voter has a preferred outcome, all refer some sort of result to inaction or gridlock. So having done that and done some modelling, they then test this with a selection of humans via the mechanism of an online game set up to represent different network topologies. So there's a couple of things here. I think probably, well, maybe not in this room, but I think that the majority of people when they're on a social network think that their network looks something like the left-hand panel. In that, whilst obviously the connections are being made between friends and people you know with various levels of sophistication, the reality is you are not making connections based on intimate details about people's particular opinions on a particular subject. People have friends and colleagues and connections for all kinds of reasons. So essentially, the belief is that the network from an information concept point of view is essentially random. Then we have the other options. The filter bubble, which is shown one example of a filter bubble being seen here, where obviously you've got orange and you've got blue, and they're seeing separated view of things, and then the one on the right-hand side. So they discovered that it's possible to wire up a network without changing the number of connections, such that a population of the participants can arrive at a misleading conclusion about the views of the network that they are actually in. Furthermore, and this is a key point, influence can be wasted because it's possible to ensure that it's directed to like-minded individuals in the network, thus not propagating further out. If you can hive off a group of individuals holding a position on some subject and effectively ensure that they waste their time on each other, and B, that others do not see the alternate position or are otherwise misperceiving of the spectrum of opinion on something, you've managed to gerrymander the network for that particular set of issues. So having done that work, they went looking for real-world examples of information gerrymandering. And spoiler, because it's published in Nature, they found them. So they found them in US and congressional body elections, as well as in data from US federal elections. And they show that information gerrymandering can also be used when one wishes to see a contentious idea remain deadlocked, or where one might wish to skew voter turnout, or where one is trying to achieve social contagion, say to inject an idea into the public spaces of a social network. So ways of changing the wiring in a network. Twitter, home, shows you the top tweets first, whatever the definition of top is. And in fact, even the latest tweets aren't really a simple reverse chronological order. And certainly on an iPhone, it doesn't happen to me so much on Android, but certainly on iPhone, Twitter has an irritating way of resetting me to the home view unless I'm paying particularly close attention to it. Here's the Nature comment on the work of Stewart and Co. The implications are alarming. In the past, information was disseminated by a small number of official sources, such as newspapers and television stations, or through real-world social networks that emerged largely from distributed processes involving individual interpersonal dynamics. This is no longer the case because social networks deploy technologies that restructure social connections by design. These online social networks are highly dynamic systems that change as a result of numerous feedbacks between the people in them and the machines and the algorithms. Those suggest connections, people respond, and the algorithms adapt to the response. Together, these interactions and processes alter what information people see and how they view the world. In addition, micro-targeted political advertising offers a surreptitious and potent tool for information gerrymandering. Cheery talk. Let's take a look then at what governments get up to. And speaking as Brits in October, we're going to start in a nice, comfortable place. It's a place far, far away, where they don't talk like us, and so on and so forth. This is China. So, if you've been paying attention to any news that's not about Brexit, the people of Hong Kong are, and have been for some considerable time, been engaged in a civil uprising against the Chinese authorities. China's been working extremely hard to control that narrative on external social media. Now here we've got data from Twitter. It's been reported on by the New York Times, an excellent article. And what we're looking at is a nation state going to the dark web, there to procure the services of brokers for various Twitter accounts at scale in order to spread anti-protester feeling and indeed engage in concerted and sustained attacks on key individuals that the Chinese authorities are concerned about. So they're getting hacked accounts that people have lost control of but still have some personal identity, and they're also getting the bot accounts and so on and so forth, and they're paying money to the dark web in order to use those things. The Chinese tweets in particular are about personal attacks on specific individuals. And those individuals ended up being arrested by the Chinese authorities, and 2 of them have not been heard from since. Now, I remember 10 years ago when Twitter was supposed to be the place where protests could be organised safely, and the authorities lacked the capability to do anything about it. Not so long ago, you may remember that the argument was about anonymous accounts and so on. That thinking from Clay Shirky and Dana Boyd, amongst others, has not really stood the test of time. Twitter's involvement in this is murky at best, but at least this data is available. You can't analyse YouTube and Facebook in the same way because they simply do not make this type of data available. This is pretty crude, but we know other far, far away countries are much better at it. And it's not the sort of thing that happens in nice, safe, liberal democracies, is it? Is it? Well, the next examples I'm going to show you involve the UK Conservative Party. The reason I'm using those examples is because they're the most recent ones that have come up in my timeline. Okay? So this is an example of an information warfare technique. Okay, so right now, you may be aware there's a set of very serious allegations actually about the use of public funds by Mr. Johnson, and the bit I had to check was whether he's still our Prime Minister, because apparently it might be in doubt, before he became Prime Minister. This is still very much a live story, okay? And here's a set of results recently retrieved from Google, last week in fact, okay? And a few hours later, a different set of results. And the difference is that in between those 2 searches, Mr. Johnson had done an on-the-record TV interview, and he'd said a few things, and his words have been directly and accurately quoted in the reporting of that interview. And at the time, his use of language seemed odd, but it turns out it's not actually the first time. You may remember this, because Mr. Johnson did something involving a red bus. Now, apparently, our Prime Minister likes to make models, there's that word again, of red buses. And as you can see from the links up the top there, he did an interview when he was running to be the leader of the Conservative Party that was really quite something. How many of you saw that interview? Few of you saw that interview. So I think you'll agree with me, I hope, that it's really quite something. Okay, it's a minute and a bit long. If you haven't seen it, it is worth your time, because it was received with astonishment and some incredulity when it emerged. And maybe there's an explanation here involving search engine manipulation of the bits of the Google algorithm that are focused on headline news. Because in this interview, not only did he talk about his desire to make models of buses, but he also made a lot of the fact that these models were made with wooden boxes that contained 2 wine bottles. And that's very odd, unless you recall that perhaps at the same time he was trying to block out the reporting on the argument he had with his girlfriend involving spilt wine on the carpet of their flat, an argument to which the police were briefly invited. And here's another one. Now, before we go any further, the Conservative Party has apologised for its advert and they have removed this advert from Facebook. So let's make that thing absolutely clear. But here's the point. It's an advert involving a headline from the BBC. Only the actual headline is, quote, "School spending, multi-billion pound cash boost announcement." And the text of this article actually goes on to say that there is some controversy about how those spending announcements are actually calculated, and that the 14 billion number that the Conservative Party arrived at isn't normally the way these things are worked out. Interesting. More interesting is this fact, because it turns out that Facebook is really quite happy for you to take basically any content, you don't even have to have the rights to it, and you could turn it into an advert, and you could change the very nature of that information from that originating piece of content, and then you can go and inject it into the Facebook network. I hope you're recalling what I was saying about information gerrymandering. Now, I don't know whether the other political parties are involved in these types of actions, but the likelihood is that they absolutely are. Your reaction might be to scoff at the narrative I've just put forward. That sort of thing doesn't happen here, only I think there's an argument that it does. The decentralised networks can be centralised as needed via the techniques that I've spoken about, and can be further manipulated by the application of money to ensure that the link and attention economies arc in the appropriate directions. I hope you're paying attention to the Facebook chat and the Snapchat videos and the rest. Now, in a moment, I'm going to try and connect that sheep that I talked about right at the start, and everything I've been talking about up until now, to the dusky backwater of scholarly communication. But before I do, the link's up there? Yeah, great. Here's a couple of infographics I want to show you from very recent Pew Research study on Get Their News. And it's interesting, it's worthwhile looking at this and reading the report. The essence of the report is that Americans are very worried about the provenance of the information they are getting. So they are starting to realise that things aren't right. What's also interesting is they realise they don't really know how to determine what is good provenance and what isn't good provenance on these networks. But I think one thing that is fascinating, okay, is percentage of each social media site's users who get their news there. And there's some quite interesting things. I would have never have thought Reddit was a news source, or Snapchat, okay? But they are. And the social demographics, which I'm just going to leave up there whilst I take a sip of water for a second, are very fascinating indeed and well worth pondering. I'll leave that up there for a moment. So, here we go. I want to talk about MMR, that's measles, mumps and rubella. And this is the story of how a country, this country, lost its herd immunity to this disease, and how the backlash against vaccines have grown. And it is a tale of 2 parts. A tale that straddles the world pre-social media, pre-peer-to-peer information networks, and post. The basics of the story, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, are simple. In 1998, an extremely bad paper was published in The Lancet, and it equated autism, which is a subject that's very close to my heart because my son is autistic, with the MMR vaccination regime. I'm going to continue using the words of Dr. Ben Goldacre, an author of many excellent books, including Bad Science, which was published in 2008. You familiar with Ben Goldacre? Good, great, some hands up, we've read that stuff, excellent. He calls this a hoax, and quote, "The blame lies with the hundreds of journalists, columnists and editors and executives who drove this story cynically, irrationally and willfully for 9 solid years. They quoted experts as authorities instead of quoting the science. They ignored the historical context, set idiots to cover the facts, pitched emotive stories against bland academics, who they smeared, and in some cases simply made things up. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, Smith, this is not exactly supporting your thesis about social networks. Well, I'm going to continue with his words, written in 2008, whilst you look at this screen grab of YouTube. It's worth taking a look at vaccine scares around the world because I'm always struck how circumscribed they are and how poorly they propagate themselves in different soils. The MMR and autism scare, for example, is practically non-existent outside of Britain, even in Europe and America. And in 2008, a decade into this, he was entirely correct. There's an entire chapter in the book on this, it's well worth a read. But the fact is, not now and not for some time. Excuse me. The WHO recorded a record high number of cases across Europe in 2018. 807 of the 24,000 cases were in the UK, and they directly attribute this rise to the loss of herd immunity triggered by a fall in the vaccination rate. In the USA, there have been multiple serious measles outbreaks, and this again, according to the Centre for Disease Control, is correlated with decreased vaccination rates locally, causing the loss of herd immunity. And measles was eliminated from the United States in 2001. This summer, we lost our measles-free status. And the story of MMR and measles is one where a disease quite literally jumps continents, and it does so as the meme, in this case that vaccines cause autism, breaks out across the peer-to-peer network of social media. A couple of celebrities and a non-stop diet of YouTube videos set to autoplay, confusing the mind as to whether the medical expert on the left or the desperate mother on top right should be believed. YouTube only stopped monetizing anti-vax videos earlier this year. Demonetizing in YouTube terms isn't just about taking away the ads, it's a material change to the way the algorithm treats uploaded material. Videos that have shown engagement, that have shown impact, are the ones that attract the ads and are also the ones that get fed into the feeds of as many YouTube users as possible. If it's possible that your interests might intersect with such a video, YouTube will throw it at you a number of times to see if it can capture your eyeballs. And here I'm going to give you a personal story because earlier this year, Google decided that I might just be possibly interested in white supremacist gun videos. You're laughing. Some of you that know me are just thinking, what on earth has been looking at? Right, I'll tell you. As near as I could work out, it happened like this. Me, I need to know how to do a carpentry thing. Google, here's some videos. Me, yay! Ooh, interesting. This one's a fella restoring a boat. Narrator, the fella was a sports fisherman from Florida. Yes, I watched a video from Florida Man. A couple of them actually, because he was doing a really good job of restoring his classic boat, and he was doing great videos. Anyway, the algorithm fires up, and it spirals out from this tight intersection of me, Florida Man, into sports and other things, and woodworking. And then one day I watch, I don't click because it's just on my phone, slightly surprised as some strange video starts to autoplay in the preview screen. And then I realise that it's about guns, and I scroll on. And that was the trigger. For the next 4 weeks, nutters with guns. And then it vanished. Anyway, here's Facebook again with a nice advert, just in case the videos aren't enough, targeting women of child-rearing age to tell you that autism vaccines kill babies. 5,000 people, less than $100. This is the world we know. A broadcast world, and this is where our minds still are, a broadcast world where information from a variety of authoritative sources on the left is filtered and curated by whatever mechanism, including partisan and biased ones, and they send that information out via the various media, newspaper, magazines, books, radio and TV. Our social networks were different. The water cooler, the pub, the living room, singular sources at any one time, broadcast consumed communally. No spoilers, sweetie. We all got the images at the same time. And our culture is one profoundly shaped by this. The BBC is impartiality, and don't we know that with the news of the last week or so? Murdoch, well, he is what he is, but not now. Now we've exchanged that for information that finds us individually, that can be targeted to us individually. Select from world where type equals will believe this thing, price too good to miss. And it touches the world of scholarship, because in our world, all of a sudden, everything should be free at the point of use, and it should be free of any restriction on its reuse and modification. It's too slow to get the information out there. Peer review that act at getting some people, for better or worse, to run their eyeballs over the information and give an opinion before it reaches the outside world. An increase in the signal-to-noise ratio. Too slow. Why bother? Get the info out there and the opinions will arrive afterwards by some miraculous means. Journals? Nah. Impact's going to be measured by likes, by eyeballs, by retweets and shares. There's nothing that could go wrong. No bad actors to spoil the party. No manipulation of the network in order. No need for herd immunity and vaccinations against bad information. If funding is to be given by these, frankly, misunderstood impact measures, and reward goes not to who gets it right, to who decreases the uncertainty, but who can attract the attention and the eyeballs, then do we really think these networks won't be exploited in exactly the same ways as in the wider infosphere? This is true. Out there is a paper conceived of by a legal firm. It was written up and been researched and written up by an Italian digital agency, and it was published in many people think is an extremely reputable journal. Its purpose is to provide the veneer of scholarly expertise to attempt to shake down a well-known manufacturer of wearable fitness devices. It must be true. It's been published in a journal. Now, I found out about this paper on Twitter when someone used this paper to try and win an argument. I wasn't looking. Twitter threw it at me not long after I managed to complete the Couch to 5K program. A tweet from somebody popular I wasn't even following. The disease metaphor, I think, is apt. Just as the foot and mouth outbreak in 2001 showed us that we did not understand the reality of the livestock industry, of how the livestock industry network functioned, the impact of information transmission across the social networks exposes the fact that our ability to discern facts from fictions is fundamentally challenged by the loss of obvious beacons radiating signal instead of noise, and the ease in which false signals can be created and propagated. There are serious consequences to the complete lack of any breaks to the transmission, to the collapse of distance, force multiplied by the exploitation of the network, both by bad actors and the network custodians who will cheerfully take the money from, well, just about anybody, and also sit back and watch the money roll in from the racist and the conspiracy nuts, the regressions of the mean. We need a vaccine. But we also need an immune system to which it can work, both regulation mechanisms within the networks and regulatory mechanisms that need to be applied to those networks. And we need to get back to some basics. We need to be able to stamp out the source of infectious pathogenic information. I'm looking at you, Twitter. And we need to be able to get ahead and be able to quarantine areas off, slow the speed at which pathogenic information propagates, control the information on how the network sees each of us, and control what we share and to whom. And we also need to understand the world that we now live in. It's no use raging against this machine, because the folks showing us how to do things we've never done before on YouTube are those better angels. The conversations and expert perspectives of Twitter and the detailed how-tos and discussions on Reddit are powerful, enlightening things, and used responsibly, they are great equalizers. A constitutional law expert is the same distance away as a racist. And I, for one, would really like it if those who think about the current ways of doing things in our part of the world, if they think it's so bad, they spent quite a bit more time thinking about how to make sure we don't fall foul of the issues that have bedeviled the other limbs of the information. Because that's the mistake that the original creators of the network made, and it's always a good idea to learn from history. Thanks for listening. Have we got time for questions? Yeah? Shoot. Not literally, please.
Go back to your immunisation metaphor. And I'm wondering whether perhaps regulation might not be the only way to have that immunisation. And maybe too optimistic to assume that we are kind of getting immunisation ourselves already with our familiarity with the system. So just like in the old days, when we read an interview about a celebrity, we'd be pretty sure that they're trying to sell something or they've got a movie out or something. So that would trigger in our minds why we're reading that. The same way we're starting to pick up triggers when we're encountering news or information.
Absolutely. So a lot of this really is a plea for us all systematically to spend a lot more time understanding how the things that we're doing really work and how that stuff really spreads. I think there absolutely is a need for education of people, particularly in schools, to start off with. But I think the other thing that I touched on really is we've got to have a conversation about the effects. If you used an analogy, right, that the car industry, right, the car industry has been regulated externally very effectively, right? It's not stopped the car industry being massively successful. It's not stopped them making money, hand over fist, right? But the fact of the matter is that the safety, I've got a 1960 MGA, and the difference between that and the car that I commute to work is, I mean, they've got 4 wheels and an engine, but that's probably about the only point of comparison. There's a NC5 safety rated thing with ultra low emissions and all the rest of it, and the other isn't. So regulation can be a spur to certainly greater economic development. I think one of the problems we are currently facing is that in the chase for revenue, it's actually really slim pickings for these organisations. I was just looking actually on the train on the way in, and Facebook in the US, I think they make about $25 per user per year. Europe, it's $8 per user per year. Asia, it's $3. So we're talking 3 or 4 cups of coffee. I mean, they're doing desperate things because they have to do desperate things to bring the money in from anywhere. And I think a conversation about the fuel into the environment, the ad money, is a conversation that needs to happen. But I also think that there is a need, as you say, to get us to be able to have examples of what pathogenic information looks like, what its characteristics are, so you can spot it. It would be wonderful, I think, if these platforms went back to where they started with a more open approach and people could build services on top of them that could possibly filter out some of this. All right, well, thank you very much indeed. Cheers.